Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
We've been looking in the last several visual presentations about the question of design. This has been part of a logical discussion that says that when the Bible says in the beginning, that statement can be proven to be true. There was a beginning. When the Bible says God created, that we can logically see that there was a cause. And for several presentations now, we've been asking, well, what is the evidence that this cause is an intelligence? And we haven't even worried so far about what intelligence. Before we get done with this series, I'd like to show you that I think you can show the intelligence is connected with the God of the Bible. And we'll make some biblical quotes in this presentation, even though those aren't offered as some kind of a proof text. But when you get into a discussion of design, automatically the question of design wisdom comes up. Okay, if there is a God, and if He did create the creation, then how do you explain all the awful things that happen? The war, the death, the disease, the tragedies, all of the things that seem to happen to everybody, no matter who they are, and no matter what circumstance in life they may find themselves. Is there somehow an incompatibility between the concept of a loving and a merciful God and the reality of life? I don't believe there's a question a human being can ask that an atheist can answer better than a believer in God can. And yet I'm afraid sometimes people give trite, canned, destructive, wrong explanations to important questions like this. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do believe there's some things about the question of human suffering that we need to look at before we continue with our discussion of God. I have some stories about my wife that are along this line. You know, my wife is one of these people that is just totally and completely open. She's just blatantly honest, and you never have any doubt about where you stand with her. And one time, some years ago, my wife was told by doctors she would be blind in a matter of months. Now, as it turned out, that prediction was premature. She's had quite a few years of pretty good vision, but at the time that they told us that, we thought she was going to lose her eyesight right away. And we had 3 little kids. And my teaching work, this work that I thought I should be doing and trying to help people see the compatibility of science and faith, was just taken off. And we're wondering, why is this happening to us? And people are trying to give us explanations. You know, they're all coming over and trying to be helpful. And one night, one of the ladies in the church we go to came over, and she was trying to be helpful, but when she got ready to leave, she turned to my wife and she said, well, Phyllis, she said, you're going to be a better person because of losing your eyesight. And after she left, my wife leaned up against the door and looked back at me and she said, you know, she said, I didn't think I was all that bad a person before. And I think that's what happens in this type of discussion. And I want to start out here saying that if you're dealing with some horrible problem in your life, if there's been some enormous loss, some terrible tragedy, I'm not going to stand here and say, hey, here are 5 magic words that are going to make that go away. And I'm not going to say to you that there's something wrong with you if you're struggling, because if we're honest, we all struggle. But I firmly believe that if we can look openly and honestly and fairly at the question of why these things happen, that we can see answers. And that we can see enough evidence that we can realize it is not incompatible with a designing, loving, compassionate God, that the kinds of things that happen in the world should happen. And some of the things I want to point out to you are probably things you've already thought about, but I hope perhaps that you can put them in some kind of connection with this question of design. For instance, I don't think anybody really believes that it is illogical for a person to reap the consequences of what they sow. Galatians 6 says, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Let me put that in my own language. Jump off a bridge, you're going to hit the bottom. Now you say, well, that's kind of dumb. Oh, no. That's 90% of what happens right there. A full 90% of what happens to us is our own doing. Let me take a couple of examples. Have you ever thought about what the word intoxicate means? Intoxicate. What does it mean? It means the intaking of a poison to the body. The person who is drunk is a person who has deliberately and systematically poisoned themselves. Do you realize that there's an enormous amount of disease, enormous amount of tragedy that has been brought into the lives of human beings because of the consumption of alcohol? What do we expect God to do? To have a big butterfly net? That every time somebody does something stupid to themselves, that He reaches out and grabs them so that nobody suffers the consequences of that? You jump off a bridge, you're going to hit the bottom. And that's true in so many areas of our lives. The man or the woman who commits adultery is going to suffer. That's guaranteed, and may bring terrible problems into the lives of others. But I would also suggest to you that this is true in a broader sense. Do you realize that the geologic evidence in the fossils and the biblical evidence says that when God first created this earth, it was what the Bible calls a paradise, a garden. In science, we refer to that as a perfectly balanced ecosystem. But we have poisoned our air. We have contaminated our water. There are places where you can't drill a well in your backyard and water your garden with water from the well because there's a probability the water will eat the plants. We have succeeded in contaminating the groundwater to that extent. Do you understand that over 90% of all cancer is now known to be caused by man-made carcinogens in the environment? Now, I have to say to you real quickly, I understand that there are people watching this presentation who have cancer. And there's probably nobody my age, at least, that has not had cancer touch your life. I've had cancer in my family. I've lost friends to cancer. And what I just said doesn't solve anything, does it? It doesn't take away the pain. It doesn't take away the frustration, the uncertainty, the financial problems. It doesn't solve one little thing. But what I'm saying to you is you cannot sit back and point the finger at God and say, God, why did you do this to me? Because God didn't do it to you. Mankind has done it to you. And every day we see more and more things that have been brought upon man by man's injudicious use of the world in which he lives. Leukemia, one of the great tragic diseases of our day and time, is precipitated by man-made synthetics in the environment, specifically benzene and benzene derivatives. None of us have to be convinced about what horrors have been brought by human selfishness and war and greed. You jump off a bridge, you're going to hit the bottom. But not all suffering falls into these pretty obvious things. There's a passage in John the 9th chapter that's kind of personal to me because of experiences in my life. And I think it demonstrates the principle that I want you to see here very, very well. In John 9, beginning with verse 1, the Bible says that as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him and said, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Have you ever seen a blind child? I had a son born blind, a baby unable to see. Let me tell you something, folks, that is not one of life's fun experiences. To have your baby unable to reach out for the rattle, unable to reach out for the bottle, unable to mimic, unable to imitate, to do all the cute little rewarding things babies do. And here was a man that was born in that condition, just like my son. And did you notice that the disciples of Jesus, they had it all figured out. They knew why this baby was born blind. It was what we already have discussed. Man's stupidity, man's sin. They just want to know who did it. Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And look at the response of Christ in verse 3. Jesus said, neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents. According to Jesus, it's not always sin. Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Now, may I call your attention to the fact that that Jesus did not say, quote unquote, this is God's will. That is the most destructive, that is the most cruel, that is the most illogical, that is the most biblically wrong thing you can say to somebody who has experienced or is experiencing a tragedy. Listen, folks, from a biblical perspective, there are a lot of things that happen in this world that are not God's will. The Bible says it is not God's will that any should be lost. Is anybody going to be lost? That's not God's will. It is not God's will that John Clayton sin. Did John Clayton sin? You bet. That's not God's will. See, there are three wills of God. There's those things that God enjoys. There are those things that God says are going to happen, like judgment. And there are those things where we hand God a problem, frequently a problem we created. And we say, okay, God, here's the problem. Here's how you need to solve it. And then we get mad if He doesn't do it that way. We have some material on this if you're interested, but I think the important thing to understand is that nobody is saying in this discussion, and nobody should say that God causes the problems or that this is God's will. There are things that happen as a consequence of being alive and well on planet Earth. And Jesus said that the works of God should be made manifest in Him. Do you think the parents of the blind child understood that? You think they said, oh yeah, now I understand? See, a lot of times we're on the wrong side of a problem to see anything good come out of what happens to us. Now later they might have understood, but not then. Now I want to come back to this story in just a minute, but I'd like to point out to you that there's a whole plethora of other issues that become a part of this. See, one of the things that we get into in a discussion like this is the fact that a lot of times our problems in dealing with the pain and suffering that surround us are because we don't realize the significance and the importance of pain and suffering. Let me take a trivial example. You cannot exist physically without pain and suffering. Yeah, I know some of you are saying, now wait a minute. I don't need pain and suffering, thank you. I will pass on pain. No, I'm sorry. You need pain to survive. My wife's problem is that she's diabetic. She's had diabetes for over 50 years. And if you're diabetic, let me say to you that diabetes is something you live with, not for. And we've had over 40 years of marriage. We've had a great time. I wouldn't trade it for anything. But diabetes does produce complications. And one of those complications that comes along after you've had it for a while is something called diabetic neuropathy. And what that means is that the diabetic cannot always experience pain in the extremities of their body. So my wife cannot experience pain in some parts of her body because of this complication of diabetes. Some years ago, we were asleep, and we have a dog that has a genetic mutation that causes it to want to lie right in the middle of where it knows you're going to walk. And this mutt was lying on the path from the bedroom to the bathroom, and my wife got up in the night to go to the bathroom, and she stepped on the dog. And the dog complained, and she jumped off the dog, and as she jumped, she hit the metal closet door that was nearby. And there's this huge crash. And that brings me up off the bed. Oh, what happened? What happened? And she said, oh, go back to sleep. I just hit the door. So I do what I'm told. I went back to sleep. But when I got up to go to work in the morning, I looked at the bottom of the bed, and her foot was every color of the rainbow. She had a serious injury. But she had no way to know that she had been injured because she had no way to tell that she had experienced the injury itself. She had no capacity for pain. You know, in the 139th Psalm, David is praising God, and he says, I will praise thee, Lord, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And indeed, this physical body you're looking at on this video is an incredible machine, ugly as it may be. A machine that, if properly cared for, might run for as long as 100 years without a valve job or a new transmission. I got to admit, sometimes I feel like I need a new transmission, but I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And one part of being fearfully and wonderfully made is the ability to perceive physical pain. We can't live without it. And may I suggest to you that that is not just true physically. It is true emotionally. It is true mentally. it is true spiritually. What kind of a man would it be? What kind of a woman would it be that could not experience guilt and sympathy and compassion? The world is full of tragedies produced by people who bury those capacities. And another place that we have been ignorant is in our viewpoint of death. You know, I look at life a whole lot different now than I did a few years ago when I was an atheist. Because when I saw life as an atheist, I saw it as the best that I was ever going to have. Life with all of its problems, with all of its troubles, with all of its pain, with all its difficulties, with all the awful things that happened. That was the absolute best that I was ever going to have. And today as a Christian, I can look at life with all of its joy, with all of its beauty, with all the fantastic things we all enjoy, as the absolute worst I'm ever going to have to put up with. Can't you see the differences as different as left and right, as black and white, as night and day? If there were no other reason to believe in God but this one, I submit to you, it would be a compelling reason. How do you look at life? As the best you're ever going to have, or the worst you're ever going to have to put up with? But I'd like to suggest to you there's a design element here that comes back to our initial discussion. See, we've been talking about all the marvelous examples of design in the creation. We've talked about Fibonacci's ratio, we've talked about marsupial reproduction, we've talked about architectural design, we've dealt with the anthropic principle, we've dealt with irreducible complexity, but ladies and gentlemen, the principle of design does not just apply to the physical world in which we live, it also applies to you. You're not an accident. God didn't throw a bunch of molecules up in the air and say, let's see what comes down, and what came down was you. You're here for a purpose. There's a reason for your existence, and I believe that statement can be made in the context of a personal God. I'm not sure it can be made if you reject the concept of God. Let me give you an example to try and demonstrate to you what I'm talking about. I want to take you back to my child. My wife and I had decided before we got married even that we would find children that did not have a good home and that we would raise these children as our own children. We thought that was something we could do to serve God, something we could do to make the world a better place. And so after we'd been married a couple of years, we found a child that did not have a Christian home. We named him Timothy because I had a dream. I had a dream I might help this little boy become a great gospel preacher like the Timothy I read about in the Bible. I knew I couldn't do that. I didn't have the training, I didn't have the academic ability, I didn't have the talent, but I thought if he wanted to do it, how could I help him do it? And so Tim became a part of our family. And I guess during the first 6 months of Tim's life, we were the happiest young couple in the state of Indiana. You know, all the joy and all the beauty that goes with a new baby. But when Tim got to be about 6 months old, it was obvious something wasn't going right. He wasn't keeping up with the other kids in the neighborhood. He wasn't keeping up with the kids in the nursery at church. Something was wrong. We got scared. And we took him to the doctor, and the doctor looked and listened and banged and thumped and did all the things that doctors do, and then he looked in the child's eyes. And he stopped. It was obvious he didn't like what he saw. And he finally came to my wife and I and said, Miss Clayton, he said, this child's going to be blind. He said, not only that, but I can promise you he's mentally retarded. And not only that, but there's something wrong with the nerves and the muscles. He's got something that I've never seen before. Not sure he'll ever walk. Turned out it was a mixture of cerebral palsy and muscular dystrophy. He said, Miss Clayton, from a medical standpoint, you need to put this baby away in an institution someplace and forget about him. Maybe you can find another baby. I hadn't had much time to grow up as a Christian when that happened. I remember going out that night to get away from the telephone, and my wife went into a store to get something, and I held this little baby in my arms that I loved more than anything in the world. And I kept saying to God over and over, Lord, this isn't fair. This isn't right. Why me? See, I had an idea about how much John Clayton ought to have to stand, and as far as I was concerned, God had just stepped over the line. Now, we had some rough decisions to make, and I understand there are times when a human being has to be put in an institution to protect them, to protect somebody else, but we're talking a 6-month-old baby. No threat to anybody. And I kept reading that passage in John. Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. I kept reading things like Romans 8:28, all things work to the good of them that love the Lord. There just had to be some kind of a design here, some kind of a purpose, some kind of an answer. And we determined we had to go just as far as we could with this child. There's been over 20 surgeries. We're dealing with a mixture of cerebral palsy and muscular dystrophy. Nobody knows how to help us very much. And I guess over the years I've seen some positives. You know, my wife and I are closer as husband and wife, having dealt with this problem together, although I've seen marriages ripped up by this type of thing. and I'm sure I appreciate my so-called normal children more, if there is such a thing as a normal child, having had this abnormal situation. But I know I never really understood what Jesus was talking about until a couple of years later. When a friend of mine wrote me and said, John, there's a young couple here that has a child born with the same problem your Tim has. John, would you contact him? Would you write him? See if you can help him. And my first reaction to that was negative. He was butting into my private life. I wasn't going to do it. But one night I sat down. I thought, I have to get rid of that. I have to do something. So my wife had some little note cards there, so I pulled one of those things out and I started writing a couple of sweeping generalizations to get justification to throw this thing away. And after I did that, I thought, I thought something else happened to us might help them. So I turned it over and I wrote about that. And then I thought about an organization that had been a huge help to us. And so I looked it up and I got another sheet of paper out and I wrote a paragraph and then another paragraph and then another paragraph and then another page and then another page. You know, I bet it cost me $1 to mail that letter. Because you see, I could say to this young couple, look, I know what you're going through. I understand how frustrated you are. I understand how heartbroken you are. I understand how your whole world has collapsed. I've been there. A majority of you watching this video cannot possibly imagine what it's like to look at your baby that you love more than anything in the world and to realize that there is no possible way that child can reach your feeblest hope. You can't imagine what that's like. Now, some of you have been there and you know exactly what I'm talking about. But all of a sudden I realized I had a talent. I had an ability because of what had happened in my life. The next weekend, providentially, I was in Schenectady, New York, and there was a leader in the church that had a child born with Down syndrome. And I was able to help him. I was able to help his wife. Back in my hometown, I had another friend that had a child born with the same problem. I was able to help them and reach out to them. There was a design in my life. There's a purpose in my life that has come out of my experience. Now, I can't go to a man who's just lost his wife and say, hey, I know what you're going through. I don't know what he's going through. I can't go to a man struggling with alcohol or with cocaine or with marijuana addiction and say, hey, I know what that's like. I don't know what that's like. I can't go to a person who's been through a divorce and say, yeah, I know what that does to you. I don't know what that does to you. There are a whole myriad of experiences that I have not had, but you have. There isn't an adult mature enough to understand what I'm saying that's watching this video that has not had experiences that are peculiar to you. You have a purpose. There is a design for your life. What are you doing with the things that have happened in your life? I submit to you that the concept of God designing the creation and having an impact in the direction of our lives gives us purpose in life, gives us direction, gives us a mission. And it is so desperately needed that people that have been through these kinds of problems and tragedies and difficulties will use them as a vehicle to reach out and to make the world a better place in which to live. Let me close this little discussion by sharing with you a little story I heard some years ago. The lady that told this story was a Red Cross nurse, and she said that she was in a place in Pennsylvania where there was a terrible train wreck. And she was the first medically trained person on the scene. And when she got there, there was a guy in a rather expensive-looking suit walking around in shock, and he was saying, my instruments, my instruments. If only I had my instruments, if only I had my instruments, over and over and over and over and over again. Well, she stood up to help him and got him out of his shock. And when she got ready to leave, she said to him, "Sir, I just wondered something. As you were walking around in shock, you kept saying, 'My instruments, if only I had my instruments.' Why were you saying that?" And the man tightened his tie a little. He said, "Young lady," he said, "I need to introduce myself." He said, "I'm the head surgeon at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. And all I could think of as I saw the terrible injuries that had been associated with this accident was, if only I had my surgical tools, if only I had my instruments, I could relieve the pain and the suffering that's been part of this terrible accident." And I wonder how many times, for those of you who are Christians, that God looks down in the world at the problems and difficulties that are here and looks at you and looks at me and cries out in frustration, my instruments, if only I had my instruments." We need to be instruments, forged according to God's plan and used for God's purpose. Now, I'm fully aware that we have raised more questions in this discussion than we've answered. I hope that we've given you a little bit of a glimpse that the concept of design does not exclude reality, and that from a believer standpoint, we can answer questions about why there are tragedies and difficulties in the world. But before we can fully answer the question, we need to understand what God is and why He created us. And so in our next presentation, what we want to talk about is, what is the nature of God? I don't know that I've ever met a person who was an atheist who really understood what God is. And I don't know that I've met more than a half a dozen believers who really understand what God is on a logical basis. Where did He come from? And how are we in His image? And why would an all-wise, all-powerful, all-knowing Heavenly Father create something as dumb and as ugly as me? Why am I here? What is the purpose of our existence? And these are things we will pursue in the next several videos. We hope that you can be with us for those presentations.
Does God Exist is an educational program which attempts to provide evidence that man can logically believe in God and that the Christian system presented in the New Testament is the best option for successful living. We offer materials free and on loan. Contact us by mail, fax, or email for a catalog, to request materials, or just to ask questions. Does God exist may be the most important question you will ever ask.